Marshall Fund, Dr. Ian Lesser.
Good morning. Welcome back. Welcome to the final day of Brussels Forum 2019. At this point, you've probably seen a world disrupted up there a few times, and I think you've probably been at more than one session where disruption was, by design, the key theme. I think, reflecting on yesterday, you might have the impression that much of this disruption, if not all of it, is somehow coming from the other side of the Atlantic. Maybe that's true. But clearly it's not the only source of disruption, and there are some things happening here in Europe as well. And so to start us off this morning, we're really very, very pleased to continue with a conversation about how to decode the European elections, what they mean, how to understand what they might be saying about European society and politics. And to have that conversation, we're really delighted to have with us a colleague of mine, but also a great friend of GMF, Ivan Krastev, the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies, and my wonderful colleague in Brussels, Rosa Balfour, senior fellow at GMF. Rosa, Ivan, please join us. Please join me in welcoming them.
So tomorrow, European leaders are going to be coming to Brussels to sit together and decide who will be the next leaders of the EU institutions. They came 10 days ago and were unable to make these important decisions. Why is that? Well, there were European Parliament elections last month, and the outcome is shall we say, creating some difficulties in choosing the leaders. The election results were not as catastrophic as many had predicted. The far right, which includes anti-EU parties, did not do as well as expected. But at the same time, the pro-European majority is more fluid. There is a less obvious coalition coming out of the vote. And so we seem to be entering a period of fluid politics in Europe, which I think has many positive aspects. We're not seeing the tribalism that we're seeing in some countries, such as the US or even the UK, much more fluidity. But at the same time, perhaps more fragmentation. So I think this would be my first question. I don't want to go into the name game as to who's going to be leading the EU institutions. We might know tomorrow night or Monday morning. We might not. The leaders might need a little bit more time. But I'd like to look at this trend. What do the European Parliament elections tell us about where Europe is going? And is this perhaps a moment in which we could see some start of a transformation in European politics and society? Ivan, what do you think?
Thank you very much. First, it's very early in the morning, so everything that we are going to say cannot be used against us. Secondly, on the name game, unfortunately, particularly, I cannot perform. I don't know who's going to get the jobs. But what is interesting about these elections, you're right, there was such apocalyptic expectations. So now Europe looked at somebody who had troubles and believed that he had a heart attack, and it appeared that it was a panic attack. So from this point of view, now the way people were so pessimistic before it, seeing basically the populist right coming with a revolution, destroying the European Union. So now we went into the other kind of a trend, trying to see a much stronger positive message than in fact it was. So for me, the most important about these elections is three things. We know who have not won. And this is the populist right. We don't know who has won. And this is one of the reasons it's so difficult also with the top jobs. We know that EPP is the biggest group in the European Parliament, but they have lost a lot. And also, basically, you see on the level of the nation states a major reconstruction. Secondly, what is important for these elections is this was elections on which none of the major parties, even on the far right, was asking for exit. You have a certain new consensus in Europe, very different than 2 years ago, that nobody believes that it's making a vote in their own country saying that they're going to exit either the European Union or the Euro. Secondly, also what happened on these elections, and in my view it was a surprise for the far right, was that migration was not the predominant issue. I have been part of a huge polling that European Council of Foreign Relations was doing. There is only one country of the 15 biggest countries in which migration was made the most important issue from the voters. And paradoxically, it was Hungary, which was not famous for having much of immigrants. But the story was that, keeping in mind what is the media control in Hungary, I do believe that if Mr. Orban has decided to convince his own citizens that poisonous snakes are the biggest threat to the European Union, he could have made it. I'm saying this because also you have a new consensus on migration, because paradoxically also on these elections, there was no any major party which is advocating open borders. I was listening, by the way, very carefully, the great Oxford-style debate yesterday. And when our Italian colleague basically was saying how morally we are outraged of people dying on the American-Mexican border, the truth is that there are more people dying on our borders than the American-Mexican border. So from this point of view, we should also be slightly moderate in our outrage. Because nevertheless, the European governments and the American government speak a very different way. There's certain type of convergence on certain type of illiberal trends which is common for the US and European Union, and we should be aware about this.
That's one point I really wanted to raise, because even if there is greater fluidity and perhaps less polarization than one might have expected, there still are some challenges within the European Union which really go towards challenging the nature and the way in which Europeans have been doing things together. So the first is, of course, the decline of liberal democracy in certain member states. The second is the fact that we have a few member states sitting at the European Council, which is the major decision-making body, and these member states are out there to extract as many concessions on the national level as possible, rather than work together to find solutions. So this is a disruption, an internal disruption, which is existential. It's not just about process. And we don't really see how Europe can try and modify this trend. Is this going to define Europe's future? Does this mean that a closer EU, a closer union of institutions and of peoples? Does this mean that this project is undermined? Of course, we have Brexit. It's whether it happens or not, because at this stage it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen across the channel, it still is a major disruption to the functioning of the EU, but also to the principles that have brought Europeans together. What do you think?
Listen, for me there were two results of the surveys that I have been seeing in the last year that made the strongest impression. Everybody is quoting the fact that according to the latest Eurobarometer, the trust in the European Union is highest than any time since 1983. At the same time, the ECFS survey showed that out of the 15 biggest EU member states, with the exception of Spain, the majority of the people fear that in 10 or 15 years the European Union is not going to be around. So you have this kind of a combination of the fact that people understand that we don't have a better option outside of the European Union, but there is a growing threat that basically we don't know what's going to happen. Because in these elections, there was something common. In all of the countries, people were voting for change, but they have a totally different idea which is the party of change. For many young people, the Greens were the change. For some people, basically, it was the populist, the change. But the status quo in the way it is, either on the national level or the European level, was not endorsed. And I do believe this is a new situation. And the second thing that I found important was a survey which a year ago was done by the Bertelsmann, which discovered that 67% of Europeans in all member states believed that life was better before. Okay? Before means different things to different people. But this is interesting. Even people in their early 20s are nostalgic about the past. And I'm saying this because for me, this is a major transformation. If you go back to the European history, you're going to see the European project was basically built by societies that feared the past and were hopeful about the future. And now you have a society that, strangely enough, are fearful about the future and very much kind of falling in love with the past. This should be changed. And I'm saying this because I do believe as a result of it also you have a major generational tensions which came up with these elections. And this was very much seen particularly in the countries like Germany, in which the people younger than 35 and the people older than 65 were voting in a very different ways. And because I mentioned Germany, also one point of these elections which I found quite important. To be honest, I do believe that Germany as a country goes weaker out of these elections than before. And this has nothing to do only with the fact that the Chancellor Merkel is at the end of her term, but also you see, for the first time you have European elections that created almost a domestic political crisis for the German government. Secondly, before in the European Parliament, when the Grand Coalition was running, both the socialists and the conservatives were very much dominated by the German parties. And this is not the case anymore. If you see at the parliamentary groups today, you're going to be shocked how much they're also geographical representation. For example, EPP, Germany is the only big country represented in the EPP. Both, basically, there is no French center-right much, there is not the Italian center-right much. And as a result of it, EPP is the German conservatives plus mostly East Europeans. Socialists is the South, with some. Greens are basically Western and North countries. Basically, there is no Eastern Europe in the Green group at all. Populists are more evenly represented. I'm saying this because I do believe this is going to be critically important, particularly if you keep in mind that in the next 6 months or 1 or 2 years, we can have external shocks coming from outside that could be critically important for the EU and particularly for Germany. Imagine just 2 scenarios. Imagine that President Trump managed to make a deal with the Chinese on trade. My guess is going to be that next there are going to be a major pressure on trade issues on Europe and particularly on Germany. And secondly, imagine that the Chinese and the Americans are not going to make a deal and there's going to be a major escalation in the confrontation. Then the pressure on the European Union and particularly on Germany to take side on the Chinese-American conflict is going to be higher. So from this point of view, I do believe that the worst that can happen to us is to believe that European elections can solve the problems that we have. It bought time, and to be honest, very important time. It also gives a confidence that it's not doomed. The populist right basically is not as strong as many people believed. But on the other side, none of the major choices that we're going to face, we are very much prepared for them. And from this point of view, there is still not much reasons to be celebrating.
Yeah, I agree. And you've mentioned the external challenges, and we've spent the past 2 days discussing precisely those. What strikes me is that the external challenges point to the urgency for Europe to get its act together and to overcome these deep structural difficulties, but also difficulties tied to the inability to respond to events, and that accumulates and undermines Europe's ability even further. But at the same time, the narrative of managing decline, we can be stronger together, it's a very negative narrative. Shouldn't Europeans focus on finding a more positive narrative that indeed can usher in a new generation of leaders with a positive project of what Europe can do and contribute to the world?
Listen, I know that the narrative is a great word, but the problem is that message in the time of crisis does not make a sense outside of the messenger. We can construct the beautiful narratives, but in time of crisis, particularly in a low-trust environment, it's easier for the people to trust a political leader than to trust a political message. What happened with the mobilization in Western Europe around the environmental issue is, in my view, very positive and important, not simply because of the environmental part, but because it's about the future. And from this point of view, you are going to see on the streets of Europe 2 types of people. One is the populists, anti-migration parties, which are criticizing the European Union for what it is doing. On the other side, you have the younger generation and the Greens criticizing them for what they're not doing. This is a different type of criticism. And for me, trying to turn the European politics towards the future, and to be honest, the future, which is going to be highly problematic. I see that I don't have time, but I remember at the end of the Cold War, America used to have a vice president. called Dan Quayle. I don't believe that he was somebody invited on the GMF major conference, but Dan Quayle coined a phrase that, in my view, equals way today. He said, "The future will be better tomorrow." And I do believe that in a certain way, both tomorrow and future should figure slightly stronger in our discourse, because European Union and European publics are too much distracted to comment on Donald Trump. To be honest, we are not in the business of commenting all the time what Americans are doing, or Chinese are doing, or Russians are doing. We should decide what we want to do.
So ultimately, we started off by saying that the EU is struggling to find its leaders, but ultimately we are saying that leadership is important. We do need to have people and not just narratives who can push forward the EU towards the future.
King Lear has it best. He said, "The worst is not if we could say this is the worst."
I think with these words, we can end our session. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the editor-at-large for The Hill, Mr. Stephen Clemens.
Good morning, everyone. Let me invite up my friend Dieter Renders, of course, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense.